Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look at a pair of pilot gloves worn during a time when airplanes were still in their infancy, a porthole that was recovered from a torpedoed ship, as well as a wartime passport belonging to a member of the Nazi resistance. Gary Melville looks at a wartime passport issued to a woman who joined the resistance in World War II.
The Dutch really know very well that we had a World War II and had to go through it, but nobody wanted to talk about it.
Jennifer Denty looks at a porthole from HMCS Trentonian, a war vessel that served in the Royal Canadian Navy.
When the Trentonian was struck with a torpedo, the ship was sinking very quickly, and the captain gave the order to abandon ship, so as many as possible made it into lifeboats.
Mark People looks at a pair of gloves that once belonged to the pilot of a First World War early fighter plane.
I know he flew a few flights, but he never really talked about it, and it wasn't until I was going through his papers that I saw that he had to sign something that he wouldn't talk about it.
Hi, my name is Shalini Deshwal. I brought in a porthole from HMCS Trentonian from the Naval Museum of Halifax. Currently, I am the co-op student, so I'm just spending my co-op term there. So it's my second term with them, really loving it, and lots to learn. I love going to museums, so yes, I love history.
HMCS Trentonian was an upgraded version of the same class of World War II corvette as HMCS Sackville, which presently serves as a floating museum on the Halifax waterfront. Trentonian was torpedoed by a German U-boat and sank off the coast of Falmouth, England in 1944. Removing items from sunken warships is highly frowned upon, and the wrecks of some naval vessels are protected by law. But that doesn't deter industrial pirates from raising barnacle-encrusted hulls for scrap metal, or some recreational divers from retrieving souvenirs. Sometimes, though, conscience prevails, and these precious artifacts are donated to museums that will properly preserve them and honor the memories of those who perished.
Hi Shalini, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I brought a porthole from the HMCS Trentonian.
What do you know about the history of HMCS Trentonian?
Not very much, actually, but I'd love to learn more. It looks warped. What happened to it?
This is actually a porthole from the ship that was recovered from the ship itself on the ocean floor. So what you're seeing is the impacts of the explosion of the torpedo on the ship itself. It sunk in about 14 minutes, and this blue color that you might assume is a patina is actually from the heat of the explosion and the fires that resulted. The warping is from just the sheer impact. And then in some places you can see where some barnacles have grown over time because the ship has been in the water for almost 80, 90 years.
Can I know more about the Trentonian?
HMCS Trentonian was a revised Flower-class corvette. The corvettes were sort of the workhorses of the Canadian Navy in the Second World War for the Battle of the Atlantic. They were quick and relatively cheap to produce, and they could get them built and out of the harbor and off to war very quickly, which at the time was a very important thing because so many ships were being lost. The Battle of the Atlantic was basically the Germans attempting to cut Europe off from allies in North America sending it supplies. So much industrial manufacturing and supplies such as food or personnel was being shipped in from Canada and then the United States when it declared war. If they could take those supply lines out, they could potentially cripple Europe and win the war. And up until about 1943, they were being quite successful at doing that. Trentonian had a crew of about 100 people, I think it was 97 to be exact, and it was on convoy escort duty. Convoys during the Second World War were organized to protect Allied shipping and to ensure that supplies, munitions, and personnel made it to Allied Europe. After a short turn, they were transferred over to more the English Channel area and were escorting D-Day convoys, and it was one of the lead corvettes involved in the D-Day invasion, and they helped to rescue survivors from the invasion. Eventually, it was sunk February of 1945 as the last corvette lost in the Second World War, and one of the last 3 ships lost by the RCN in the Second World War.
Judging by this porthole, it's pretty mangled. So what was the human loss when it went down?
The ship was sinking very quickly, and the captain gave the order to abandon ship, so as many as possible made it into lifeboats. Some were not so lucky. One individual was actually trapped. When the torpedo hit, the metal kind of bent back, and he was actually trapped in that metal. So they tried to save him, but they couldn't. It was heartbreaking because the poor young fellow was still alive. They could hear him until the ship actually sunk, and that will haunt some of those crew members until the day they died. In total, the ship lost 1 officer and 5 non-commissioned members who died, 1 on the lifeboat of injuries, another 14 were injured, and they lost their dog. The North Atlantic, especially in the winter, is a very, very cold place, so you risk exposure, hypothermia. You could be washed overboard with the right wave. Sometimes they would run out of food, or if they were picking up merchant seamen who were survivors of ships that had been sunk, what was already cramped quarters would be even more so, and food would be stretched even more thinly. You had the potential to get sick more often. You could be sunk and killed and drowned. It was all in all not a great experience.
So how did the Naval Museum of Halifax receive this item?
In May of 2021, thereabouts, Roger Littweiler was contacted by an individual who was a diving instructor. Roger Littweiler is a very well-known, well-respected historian who has a personal passion for HMCS Trentonian. And his book on HMCS Trentonian's story is very well regarded as a beautiful unit history. As a result of this passion, he was contacted by the instructor on a diving course who, even though he had warned his students not to take anything from the wreck when they were doing a technical dive on HMCS Trentonian, he discovered that some of his students had taken a couple of portholes from the ship. Even though they're not legally protected as war graves, they are considered to be, so there's sort of a moral and an ethical responsibility. Look but do not touch. Roger was able to connect with the RCN Heritage staff and the museum and determine that one of the portholes was to come to the museum, and one of the portholes was to be sent to the Maritime Museum of the Great Lakes, which is currently located in the historic dockyards where Trentonian was built. We are pleased to be chosen as the caretakers for this significant piece of history.
So what is the Naval Museum of Halifax going to be doing with this artifact?
Currently, this porthole is on display in the second floor lobby of the museum, and over time we are going to permanently incorporate it into our Battle of the Atlantic Second World War exhibition. Well, Shalini, thank you very much for coming on the show today and helping me share the history of this HMCS Trentonian porthole.
Thank you for this opportunity.
It's really wonderful to see, especially youth, taking an interest and really taking those extra steps to learn more about their Canadian history.
I think history is really important. It's something that everybody should know and to better prepare themselves for life and know about the past, to not make the same mistakes in the future. But if you're in the Navy, I think the museum is a really great resource to kind of learn about what you're going into and where we've been and where you can go.
Coming up on Militaria.
He never really talked about it, and it wasn't until I was going through his papers that I saw that he had to sign something that he wouldn't talk about it. My name is Shari Bernard Ostrom, and today I brought in some artifacts that were my grandfather's from World War I and World War II. He was a pilot throughout World War I, and because of course he was quite young in World War I, he was a flight instructor in World War II.
Airplanes were still in their infancy at the start of the First World War. It had been just 11 years since Orville Wright made his 12-second flight at Kitty Hawk. Military leaders understood the tactical advantage of controlling the sky. Initially, planes were mainly used for surveillance, but once engineers worked out how to add a machine gun that wouldn't shoot off the plane's own propeller, the fighter plane was born. Bombers soon followed. Troops on the ground now had to fear death from above. Thousands of monoplanes, biplanes, and triplanes took to the clouds. Daring dogfights made legends of pilots like the Canadian flying ace Billy Bishop and Manfred von Richthofen, the dreaded German Red Baron. The fighting of wars had changed forever.
Well, I'd like to welcome you, Sherry. Today we're going to look at an interesting collection you brought in to share with us. It's fairly historic for a number of reasons. Let's sort of dive right in and see what we have. Right. So this particular sign piece is the discharge papers for your Father, and he was involved in the First World War, and he was a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, and he was involved in action over the Western Front and flying through that period. So the discharge paper is a fascinating piece because when we look, we can see the signature of the king at the point. The question if that's actually a real signature is obviously the discussion, but the inversion is that it is. The other exciting thing about it, of course, is that it's embossed with the Royal Air Force and it's signed April 1st, 1918, because that's the day that the Royal Air Force was formed. We have examples of dress gloves here. These dress gloves are a part of their uniform, and they would have worn them ceremonials.
Yeah, my mother said that those were his flying gloves. So you're saying those aren't actually flying gloves, they're dress gloves?
No, because they were flying in the wooden fabric-covered aircraft. They needed very thick woolen sort of clothing and items. And that's another reason why they wore the long leather coats. And you can see the long leather coats here.
I was surprised about the gloves because I was always told they were flying gloves, whereas they're dress gloves. And hearing more just about what it was like for them flying, it was really interesting.
This particular item is interesting because it's an actual RFC wing. The Royal Flying Corps was part of the British service at that point and then eventually evolved into the Royal Air Force. And it's actually very rare to see the Royal Flying Corps wing. The Royal Flying Corps was formed in 1912. They started experimenting with aircraft. Basically, wooden aircraft with fabric was thrown up in the skies, and aviation and technology was expanding. And the use of aircraft was evolving. The nature of the World War I, and particularly in Europe, was a trench warfare. So they were using aircraft in different forms. They were using for reconnaissance initially to find out exactly where the enemy was and where it was moving. And then that sort of reconnaissance evolved into fighting over the trenches and then started arming the aircraft with guns and machine guns. And at some point dropping bombs because they were evolving from literally taking bombs and dropping them over the side.
So if my grandfather was the pilot, how were they shooting like through propellers? And
essentially, when they first started fighting in 1914, pilots were literally carrying pistols and trying to shoot each other as they went across the sky. And they figured out that they could create a machine gun that would actually fire through the front of the aircraft and avoid the propeller. And it was called an interrupter gear. The propeller would actually arc across in between the gun firing. So it literally could fire and they wouldn't shoot the propellers off. The risks of World War I pilots were extreme. Trained in rudimentary training aircraft that was made of wood and fabric. So the risk just getting up and flying that aircraft, and that's even before the enemy started shooting at you. Your odds were very much stacked against you. So Sherry, let's talk about your grandfather. Who was he?
well, his name was Robert Simpson Pattison. His older brother was killed pretty early on in Europe, so he decided to lie about his age and go and take his place. He was a lovely, actually quite a gentle man, going off and fighting for his brother. That sounds so tough, but he went to do his part because his brother had passed.
How old do you think he was when he actually joined up?
I guess he was 17, or he was almost 17 when he signed up. Somehow he managed to convince people that he was older.
Obviously, there's a number of cases, and a lot of young people did sign up that probably shouldn't have signed up, but decided that they wanted to join the war and be the effort. It was very easy to, create a document that was forged or even just lying on your attestation papers when you joined up. This was common throughout the First World War. Soldiers that were essentially boys that were sent up to the trenches. A World War I pilot's life expectancy, I think in most cases, was probably around 10 weeks. Basically, you were thrown to either fight or flight, and at the end of the day, there were very high casualties from it. You have a number of items that you survived 100 plus years. How did you come across all these items?
My mother got them after my grandfather, her father, passed away. And I knew the gloves were around, but I didn't know about anything else. So I was amazed to find there was a few letters and photographs and so forth. So I know he flew a few flights, but he never really talked about it. And it wasn't until I was going through his papers that I saw that he had to sign something that he wouldn't talk about it. So who knows?
The thing that stood out most when Sherry was talking to us today was the fact that she really didn't know what the collection really was. So I think she had a bit of a discovery today. I think it probably opened her eyes to exactly what she has and what that collection represents.
To breathe the life into what was going on in the war and hearing about how a 17-year-old and go and sign up and be flying in these rickety planes. It makes it very much more real. And I hope that we don't lose the history. By making it somebody's story, I think it anchors it a little bit more.
Your grandfather actually had 2 wars.
Oh yeah, he volunteered to go back in to be an instructor for pilots in the Royal Air Force. I know he didn't really talk very much about it, but I know he was very proud to do it. And there was actually some of my other paperwork that I had a letter thanking him for that too.
The lessons of World War I created the seeds of modern combat and modern use of air warfare, and even maneuvers were created in World War I that are still used today. So Shari, this is a great collection. It's an homage to your grandfather and his World War I service, and obviously his Second World War service, which is significant. Just the rarity of seeing World War I items today is very unique, and I certainly appreciate you bringing them out and then coming up and trying to tell part of your grandfather's story. And I think obviously there's more story to be told.
Yes, well, thank you so much for all the information you've given me. I learned a lot more about my grandfather. I'm glad I came.
Well, it's great to have you. Thank you. The air component of the First World War was very rudimentary. Technology grew over the 4 years of the war, and a typical pilot like her grandfather would have seen these changes as he donned his great leather jacket every day to take that plane up.
Coming up on Militaria.
The Dutch really know very well that we had a World War II and had to go through it, but nobody wanted to talk about it. My name is Stella van der Lucht. I brought in a passport and some pictures of my aunt, Annie van der Lucht. Annie was born in February 1919, and at a young age of 23, she decided to join the resistance in the Netherlands and work through World War II.
The Nazis perpetrated unthinkable brutalities against Jewish children. Approximately 90% of Europe's pre-war population of Jewish kids died in the Holocaust, an estimated 1.5 million girls and boys. Among those who survived the war were thousands who had been secreted away from the Germans. They became known as the hidden children. Jewish parents sent their kids into hiding with Christian families and their organizations. After the war, surviving adult Jews searched for their young relatives. For those who had been hidden as infants, leaving their rescuers was often traumatic, as they had no memory of their birth families. For many of the hidden children, no family remained for reunion.
Stella, welcome to Militaria, and thank you for coming in and bringing these wonderful artifacts. I was wondering if you could take a moment and explain to us what you brought today.
Thank you, Gary. I brought my aunt's passport, which was given to her during wartime, as well as her identity card and a picture of my aunt Annie van der Lucht.
What was this ID card?
The ID card was a mandatory card mandated by the Germans during the occupation. Everyone had to carry one on them at all times.
And can we open it up? Because there's lots of different information on here, and I was wondering if you could share that information with us.
It has a photograph. It has the address of the person on it, as well as their occupation and where they work. And on the other side are fingerprints. With the fingerprints, the Germans prevented people from walking around with fake ID cards. If you didn't have one, it meant that you were immediately brought to a bureau for interrogation.
What are the significance of your aunt and these artifacts that you brought in?
When I was doing research on the book that I'm writing, I started digging into my family history and discovered that my aunt actually joined the resistance.
And what exactly did you find out that led you to discovering that she was part of a resistance cell?
Well, there were letters from the children's home where she worked. And that's when I started digging into the history of the children's home and found out that the children's home actively participated into hiding Jewish children into that home during World War II. She worked there, and then I put the pieces together. They got fake ID cards. They went on the street, on a walkabout, and were hiding in plain sight.
It was interesting discovering other aspects of the resistance, harboring Jewish children, and that in itself was resistance, and it's an important story.
It was incredibly difficult for Jewish people to go around in Amsterdam. There were razzias held all the time, so roundups, where people were stopped at the streets and asked for their ID cards and put into trucks and deported to Westerbork, which is a Dutch concentration camp. It became more and more difficult for these people to move around freely, so they had to go into hiding. This resulted in people going into churches, people going into little rooms behind houses, and to trust people was really difficult. At some point, the Germans put bounties on people's heads. Everybody that reported a Jew was given 7 guilders and 50 cents. That, unfortunately, prompted a lot of people who had nothing to report these people just to try to feed their own family.
Obviously, there was an element of danger involved in what your aunt was doing. Did you discover any times that she was close to being caught?
My uncle told me the story of my aunt Annie, and you have to imagine 23 years old, going to Germany to one of her missions. She noticed a guy paying attention to her in the train. So she decided to get out at the next train station, and the guy went out as well. So she decided to go walk through the city of Hilversum, and in the reflections of the store windows across the street, she saw this guy looking into store windows as well. So she thought, uh-oh, I'm being followed. So she took the train back to Amsterdam. And at Amsterdam Central Station, which is the end station, she walked up to him, he was in uniform, and she said, well, sir, I believe you're following me all day around. Isn't it time for you to offer me a cup of coffee? And he nodded his head and he left.
So if she hadn't been diligent, that could have been it for her.
It could have been it for her and for the children's home and a lot of other people, yes.
There are 25,000 Jews were hidden that were not discovered during the war. In a nation of 9 million, doesn't sound like a lot, but I think it really was. It all added up to something. What can you tell us about your aunt? What did she do in the children's home, and what happened to her after the war?
So my aunt was born as the oldest child of my grandfather. Her mom passed away when she was only 8 years old, and that's when she got raised by my grandmother until she left home at a very young age. I believe she was only 16 or 17. She started living in Bussum while working in Amsterdam. She found employment at the children's home, and she worked there until the house ceased to exist in the early 50s. He was never married. She never had any children. Must have lived kind of a lonely existence. We knew her as our aunt. We didn't see her a whole lot. So it was just a family member that we knew of, that we saw at weddings and anniversaries and birthdays, that kind of thing.
I think that if you dug into family histories of people that lived through the Second World War, I think you're going to find a lot of stories like that. A little bit of resistance if you're occupied, or a big piece of resistance. Most people cannot do just nothing. So Stella, thank you so much for bringing these artifacts in. What's the next step in your discovery of your family's history?
Well, the next step for me is to finally finish that book that I'm working on for 10 years. And eventually, I like to get this under the attention of our current youth, because I think this story can never be forgotten. You should learn about other cultures and differences you might have, get to know them and their backgrounds, because that's the only way we can learn from the past and we can avoid things to happen in the future.